Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I am pumped to start today's show. We have with us Kaytia King, who is the Deputy Director, ISWI Initiative Partnerships at forward.us, that's FWD.us, and Marissa Molina, who is a Colorado Dreamer. So we are talking immigration today, and I am excited for this topic. It has been one that has been a heated debate and in the news a lot per our new administration since 2016. It's one of those things that is pretty contentious amongst most audiences. But one of the things that Colorado Business Roundtable is really proud to do is to work with businesses across Colorado and somewhat nationwide as well to make sure that we're updating this immigration policy that we have, right? So again, welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us. We're glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Wonderful. Well, Kaytia, what I do with all of my guests as they're in studio is I start with a background with them. So if you'll let me know how you got started in at forward.us and why this was such a motivator for you.
Yeah, so I started in Colorado at Forward US about 3 years ago now, and really opening up the Forward presence here. So building coalitions of business folks, tech folks, building relationships with all the members of Congress here. And at that time, we were just doing federal immigration policy. So really working towards common sense immigration reform. And for us, that was smart security, making legal pathways easier without the things like you see in terms of backlogs for green cards, as well as other difficulties around visa programs, and then, of course, a path for the undocumented to citizenship.
Awesome. So you said common sense immigration reforms. Go into a little in depth in that for me.
Yeah, so those three things that I just mentioned, but also in a bipartisan fashion is really important to us. As a bipartisan organization, we work with folks on both sides of the aisle. And this really, despite what the news might tell you, it doesn't need to be a bipartisan issue. There are people on both sides who really understand the humanitarian as well as the economic impact of moving immigration reform forward. And of course, we haven't had a major overhaul to the system since the invention of the internet. And so think about how much has changed since that. And really, we need a system that is made for the present day, and we just don't have it. And that's why you're seeing, I think, so many of the issues that come up in immigration.
Absolutely. Well, Marissa, tell me about your background and what got you started with the Colorado Dreamers.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Western Slope in Glenwood Springs. I came to the United States when I was 9 with my family, and grew up undocumented and graduated from Glenwood Springs High School, went on to college in Colorado at Fort Lewis in Durango, and, was really able to finish college because of DACA. So right around the time when DACA came about, I was like, my parents' savings had ran out. They'd maxed out credit cards in order to be able to pay for school because I was paying out of state tuition at the time. And so was really considering not going back to school. And so DACA was announced, and it gave me the opportunity to go back to school and to be able to finish my education. And then for my senior year, the Colorado State Legislature had passed the asset bill, which granted in-state tuition to Dreamers. And so both of those things combined, DACA, asset, gave me the opportunity to graduate from college. And after graduating, I really asked myself, what do I do? How do I contribute back to a community that's given me so much? And my community in Glenwood was so supportive of me in so many different ways, of me and my family. And so I became an educator and taught in the far northeast of Denver, 9th and 10th grade, and loved it and loved being able to talk to students and talk to families about the value of education, but also how important it is for us to have a larger conversation with community members around the issues that impact us, because often we're not talking to folks in our community around it. And so have spent some time in education, and I think it's so important for us to be able to share our stories and to talk about who we are as dreamers. I think given some of the conversations we're having at a larger scale, it's easy to say oh, those dreamers, but not put a face to it. So for me, it's really important to be able to share my story so that I can really highlight for people who we are and what we're doing and how we're contributing back to our communities.
Oh, yeah, that's wonderful. Well, and congratulations on being a teacher. That's not an easy job. So I want to get that out there for for sure. Well, let's paint a picture a little bit here of what a dreamer does look like. Obviously, you're a dreamer, and I guess I didn't realize actually that you were paying out of state tuition, even though you'd been a resident of Colorado for since you came here, right?
Yeah.
When you were very young. Um, yeah, I had no idea that was even an issue.
Yeah, so I graduated high school in 2010, and again, this was before the asset bill that passed in the state of Colorado that granted in-state tuition for undocumented students. And so when I was getting ready to go to college, there was no pathway for me to go. I was considered actually an international student despite having lived in the US for the past, at that point, 8 years. And so it was like a pretty significant hurdle. I am really lucky to have had so many community organizations in Glenwood Springs who gave me scholarships, and that's how I was able to pay for part of that. But then I still had an outstanding balance of like $12,000 that I was paying out of pocket. And, my parents are incredibly hardworking people, and they said, we came to the United States to give you a better opportunity at life and for you to pursue your dreams. So we're not going to stop regardless of this barrier. So they worked really hard, and I cleaned houses with my mom in between my years, like during the summer, to be able to pay for school. So that's how I was able to get through that time. And then having DACA after 2012, when it was announced, really gave me an opportunity to say, like, I'm going to graduate with a degree that is going to mean something. Because at the time, one of the things I often thought about was like, what does it mean for me to be working this hard and for my parents to be breaking their backs to give me this education when I will graduate with a piece of paper that's going to mean nothing without a social security number. So having DACA was like, I am now working towards like the future I came to look for when I came to this country.
Well, yeah, and that's the reason most people come here, right? When we talk about immigration, we have this dream, the American dream, quote unquote, where we're a free country, we're the leaders of the free world, right? And so you do come here so you can have opportunities that you wouldn't have in your home country, and to know that that's just being damaged because you weren't able to you might not be able to finish your schooling because of this inane policy, really, is just heartbreaking to see. And that's a lot of our population, really.
Yeah, so Colorado has just a little under 17,000 folks who are DACA recipients. There's about 24,000, including those who are eligible for the program but may have not applied. We certainly have seen some drop off in the program since it's been canceled, and there's been problems with processing time, so people have fallen out. And then once you get a gap, it's very hard to kind of get back in that. If you have a lapse, you may have to reapply as if you are a new application. And so the wait times have been longer, and we've definitely seen applications drop off. But, we had this Supreme Court ruling a few weeks back that they decided that they would not be hearing the case on DACA. And so we really are encouraging folks to renew if they have DACA now and extend those work programs as long as they can continue.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's get into depth about that because I don't think a lot of people may not know what DACA is exactly and what that does. Yes, it helps people go to college, but what else does that entail? What does the application process look like? Why are you seeing dropouts?
Yeah, so I'll let Marissa speak to what the program is and how you qualify and what the application looks like, and then I can speak a little bit about the dropout rate.
Yeah, so DACA granted folks like myself who came to this country as kids the opportunity to be protected from deportation for 2 years and have employment authorization and a social security number to do that. But that was a program that lasted for 2 years. So every 2 years you have to renew. And part of the renewal process is paying a fee that's like $490 right now. It is going through an extensive background check, getting fingerprinted, and so like all of that application process. So being a DACA recipient really means that like the federal government has looked into every single aspect of our life in order to determine like whether or not we would qualify. And I think an important part of the program is also that you had to have come to the United States before you were 15 and had continuous presence up until the day that the program was announced. So it's not like by having DACA, new people could come and just apply and qualify for it. I think that's often a misconception about what the program does. So there's some pretty strict requirements around qualifying.
Yeah, I would imagine. Well, and how long did that process take for the background check and the fingerprints and stuff? And I hate to say this because we do work with a lot of government entities, but sometimes the government's not as quick as it should be when it comes to application processes.
Yeah, so in my experience, that's taken anywhere between 3 to 5 months, and so you are encouraged to apply within 120 days.
Yep.
Yep, 120 days. But right now, it's really important that people renew because we're still in this like uncertainty and this limbo. But it takes some time to be able to get there. And, we've seen some folks who, for any number of reasons, have that process has taken longer and they have fallen out of status.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's talk about the dropout rate, and because this was canceled, and now we're in limbo.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a complicated timeline, but basically September 5th in 2017 is when you saw the former Attorney General come forth and essentially say that the program would end. Then what followed was a number of court injunctions in smaller circuit courts, specifically California and Washington, D.C., I believe. And so they said that the program wasn't rescinded in like the procedural correct ways, and so that the administration and the offices that control the program would have to continue taking renewals. And so you had people stop for a while, but then you had like the gates essentially open again to applications. But I believe at that time you weren't taking new applications for DACA recipients. And so people who had been aging into it, so like high school kids who could have qualified now, are left in feeling how Marissa was feeling when she talked about before asset had occurred, and that there's not a lot of hope for people in terms of what am I going to do now after graduating high school if I can't apply for this program? What does that look like for me? And so I think the other thing is we've really seen an atmosphere and an attitude from the administration that didn't encourage people to give over all of their information to the federal government to qualify for a program like this. And I think that some folks may have weighed the cost benefit differently with this new administration than they maybe did before. And of course, it's also, a financial hurdle to give $500 and go through the background check, and it takes some time. Giving away your information if you live with your parents and you have a mixed status family or things like that might just not seem worth it at that time. So I think all of those things are pieces that came into play in terms of people not applying anymore for the program.
Which is sad. It's a program that should be afforded to everyone, and it's sad to see it go through so much turmoil.
Yeah, and I think, it's been a great program. It has done wonderful things for a lot of people, upwards of 700,000 across the country. But at the end of the day, DACA was never a permanent solution. Living your life in 2-year increments is not something that I can imagine, but it's something that Marissa and thousands of other people have to deal with every day. Thinking about like long-term planning in terms of, can I buy a house? Can I go to get a professional degree or licenses that I need? And I think that really is damaging in a way that people don't understand unless you're in it. And so that really spills back to our need for, we need comprehensive immigration reform, because these are people who have been living here for upwards of decades. Like Marissa said, you have to have been here by the time you were 15. They have lives here. Some of them have kids. They're married. Mixed status families. They have jobs. They own houses and all of those things. To pull these people out of their lives and out of the country, it's not economically feasible to enforce that kind of thing. But it's also just like, these folks are not threats to public safety. They're contributing members of society, and we should allow them to contribute in a way that is sustainable for their lives and for the country.
Let's talk economics.
Sure.
Right? Because I think that's the one big argument that I'm seeing on both sides of the aisle here about immigration is, one, jobs are being taken, which is such a myth. But I would like to get into that conversation with both of you. And the other thing is that if I'm, not only am I taking your jobs, I'm also just sucking off the government here, right? So let's talk about the economics and in real statistics, what immigration looks like in the States, because it's awesome, actually.
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that, in terms of our national priorities at Forward, we're really focused on permanent protections for Dreamers and TPS holders, TPS being temporary protected status, which we haven't talked about yet. But those are folks who have come here from specific countries that were undergoing some kind of, whether it's like a natural disaster or war, who are allowed to come here. And again, these are folks who've been here for upwards of decades now, who have families here, own houses, and so on. In Colorado, we have about 3,000 TPS holders from the top 3 countries that are recipients, which is El Salvador, Haiti, and Honduras. We have the 17,000 or so plus Dreamers in the country. In the state of Colorado. So that's 20,000 people that we're talking about pulling out of the economy. So even without talking about the money that it would take to enforce and remove people, we're looking at a $915 million dollar loss for just the state of Colorado alone in annual GDP. And to paint a picture of what that looks like, these folks own businesses, they own houses, perhaps multiple properties, they employ people. And so it's, you go into a restaurant in Breckenridge and you can't get any service because they're understaffed, or they're closed altogether because they can't keep up with the influx of people coming with the employee needs. You go into schools and the kindergarten teacher is missing because she's in deportation proceedings, and now that's a class of 24 small children that are not getting their education needs met. It's the folks who are providing health care to your grandmother in her assisted living facility. And when those people can't show up to work, what that looks like is a lot further stretching than I think people really imagine. And it's a dark picture to paint to imagine this country without the contributions of immigrants.
100%. And just to reiterate there, $950 million in GDP just in Colorado.
915, yes.
15, excuse me. Still, yeah, really just small numbers there being the difference, but that's a lot of money that goes right back into the communities here. I want to talk with you, Marissa, here about the stress of that 2-year waiting period, and particularly when you were in college, right? You're already a stressed college student worrying about being able to afford groceries and making sure you're studying for your finals, and being an educator is an extra. I know that there's a lot more classes that are strenuous on you when you go into the education field. But you have this added stressor that not a lot of average college students now are dealing with. So do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, so I actually didn't go through the process of renewing until I had left college. So I got DACA my junior year. So by the time I was up for renewal, I was out of college. But I think the stress then, right? I renewed for the very first time when I was in my first month of teaching. And so I often thought about, right, I'm applying within the window that they have given me. What happens if it doesn't come in time? What happens if I need to go get my fingerprints, right? And I need to ask for a time off, and can I get that time off secured? So all of those different pieces were incredibly stressful. And I know, having other friends who were teaching under DACA, I've seen that happen. I've seen people fall out of status because either they weren't able to afford the $500 fee, or because their permit didn't come in time, right? And people who continue to show up to school to teach our students because that is what mattered to them, even when at the end of the day they were not getting a paycheck. So that was like a constant worry in my mind. And then after September 5th of 2017, when the Trump administration announced the end of the DACA program, what I kept thinking was like, I have until it was at the time August of 2018 in order to be able to figure out what is going to happen to me and find a solution. And I would often come, and I was no longer teaching but still working in a school, and I would come to my school and have a conversation with my boss. And I'll never forget, I had a conversation with him in December, and I said, I need us to have a plan for what it'll look like if I can't come back to work for next school year. And he looked at me and he said, like, we're not going to make that plan because we're not going to need it. And I was like, I want to believe that, but at the same time, I want to be realistic about what that means. And so we set forth a plan of what would happen if I was to fall out of status without a solution. And that was really scary. It was scary to think about that. I'm also, like Kaytia said, I come from a mixed status family where my parents, and my two siblings were able to adjust their status. And I had turned 21 and had aged out of this priority category that U.S. Immigration Services has. And so now I face a 25-year wait to adjust my own status. And so it was also the feeling of, my parents saying, like, how can we keep you here? How can we make sure you have the protection that we have? How can we keep our family together? And so it was a very stressful time, not just thinking about my employment, but thinking about what does that mean for my family, and how do my parents plan around perhaps a reality that's like pushing me out of the only country I've ever called home.
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot of time here, but the 25-year wait. What? That's crazy. So you went from being on an every 2 years to now you have to wait 25 years to change your status?
Yeah, so like Kaytia said, DACA is not permanent, so the way to adjust it is through these petitions, and my family petition, because I'm now over 21 and consider not to be like relying on my parents, right, for my day-to-day living. I now face that 25-year wait line, which is, I think, why it's so important for us when we talk about immigration to talk about, like, yes, border security is important, but what's really important is that we understand that, like, we need to do a comprehensive overhaul of what this system has looked like, because it's no longer feasible to say, like, this is what a wait line looks like, because by all means, my family has done things the right way of, like, we've petitioned through different family members to adjust their status. My parents eventually were able to, but that left me out.
Wow, that's so sad to see that. You're literally separating families. I have just a couple minutes here, and on that, I want to talk a little bit about an overhaul of what Forward.us is doing nationally right now, what they're working on, and we'll probably have to continue that conversation in the next segment, but just an overview would be lovely to know, nationally speaking.
Yeah, so our top priority is really providing permanent legislation for both Dreamers and TPS holders, and we believe that that means not a Band-Aid fix. That's another, there has been talk about like codifying DACA and what that looks like, but that doesn't prevent what Marissa's talking about in the 2-year increments. So we really need a pathway for citizenship that both people in these groups can get on. I mentioned it's about 20,000 people in Colorado, but nationally, the TPS and Dreamer population is over 1 million. And they're people who are already here, and so that they're contributing. I mean, you have like 95% rates of either employment or in school. And so with that and the history of how long they've been here, these people are not a burden on society. You mentioned earlier about the narrative around using like public aid, government aid. You're not eligible to use aid from the government as a undocumented person. You can't access the other programs that I think there is a notion around people being like a leech on in terms of using these programs. And that's just not true, because you can't access them as any of these individuals. And so I think that's something that people really need to think about in terms of these are hardworking folks. We talk about Dreamers being, American and everything but paperwork. And I think that, like I said before, like they're your teachers, they're they're the hospice care who comes in to take care of your grandparents, they're the nurses, the folks all around you who are helping get through the day to day. They're the people who fix your roads. They're the people who build what we're seeing in Denver in terms of the infrastructure coming up. They're all around us, and they're making Colorado a better place to live.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break, but we're definitely going to get back into this conversation. I have a lot more questions to follow up with you on. So stay with us here on Connect and Collaborate. Be sure to find this podcast and more at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. Once again, I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I have in studio with me Kaytia King, who is the Deputy Director, ISWI Initiative Partnerships at Forward.us, and Marissa Molina, who is a Colorado Dreamer. So thank you both again for joining me on Connect and Collaborate today to talk immigration. So we were talking in the last segment about overall immigration policy and what Forward.us is working on nationally speaking. So we were talking here on the break about what we can do in the interim. Because if I asked the question if we could drive the power back to the states rather than a national overhaul. Obviously, we need a national immigration policy, period. That needs to happen. But if we were to turn it to the states, would that make it easier? So what do we have going on?
Yeah, so Forward is in a really exciting moment in that we are finally able to take on some state policy work. And so we have a little different priorities in the states that we're in, but we're here in Colorado doing some state policy work. We're also in Georgia, Florida, Texas, as well as New York. And so here, our priorities are really getting a driver's license fix for the undocumented folks here. And this has been enacted into law for a few years now. We saw if you had a Social Security number, which some people do have even though they are undocumented because they've been here in the country for a long time. And then there was a fix on eligibility for people who had ITIN numbers. And so those have been two bills that have passed to make it more accessible. Now the problem that we've run into in this state is that there is a small number of offices that provide these driver's licenses. So you're running into very long wait lists for people to get appointments with their DMV offices, and there's only 4 in the state, 3 of which are doing the actual new applications, 1 does renewals. And so, if you're somebody who works in construction in Lamar and you get a driver's license appointment after waiting for 3 months, that's like a full day trip to get to the closest DMV office to get one. And so that's a big deal, and we're really focused on rural access to getting these DMV appointments so that people can live their lives. We talked before about how much immigrants are integrated into our daily life, but thinking about what your life could look like if you live particularly like on the Western Slope or in the Eastern Plains, how difficult that can be without a car, and having to, share transportation or carpool and depend on other folks who have driver's licenses to pick your kids up from school if they're sick. Get to doctor's appointments on time, get to work on time when the bus fails due to weather inclinations. All of those things you don't have to think about if you can drive your own car, but a license is a huge deal for people, and it's a real, symbol of freedom of what you can access if you have them. So we want to make sure that people across the state are able to get to DMVs. And so we're really pushing for more offices to be open on that.
I can't imagine. I already hate the DMV and the long wait lines that I have to deal with. So I can't imagine having to make a whole trip to a special office. That is just a hindrance I would not want to deal with. So, but at least we're getting there. We're working on things, which is beautiful to see. I also want to talk here about technology's role. As you mentioned, we haven't upgraded the immigration policy since before the birth of the internet, right? So I imagine there's so much that we could be taking advantage of that we're just not.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at specific programs, you can see that we haven't always encouraged innovation. One of the things that came up 2 years ago was the international entrepreneur rule, so making it easier for international entrepreneurs to come here and start businesses. That would have allowed a lot of folks, so like international students could potentially apply, but business investors who wanted to come here and start businesses, who could prove that they were going to be hiring and employing Americans as well. And we didn't see that rule get implemented to a point that was very sustainable because we saw the administration cut it off early. But, innovative laws. There's also, we talk about green card country caps. So let's say Sweden has 300,000 visas that don't get used. We don't reallocate them to other countries, which could potentially really help someone like Marissa, who's got now a 25-year-long wait line for a country like Mexico. And you see that backlog with India and China and the Philippines as well, where people maybe the parents can come and they applied when their kid was in pre-K, but by the time that they actually get accepted and their application is finalized and they can come in, the child is no longer a child. And think about where you might have been at 18 or 21, now having your parents have to choose to leave folks behind in the country that you may have come from, or come to the States without one of your family members, and then having that family member have to get in that line where you may not see them for another 25 years in this country.
Wow. That is just frustrating. I hate that. But hopefully we can get there. That being said, I have to talk about the wall, right? That is something that the Trump administration has been hammering on and on about. Recent comments that he's made are he'll even build a human wall if he needs to. I have no opinion on that, per my boss. But that being said, the wall is something we do need to talk about when it comes to immigration policy. Any thoughts or facts from you on that?
Sure. So Forward is an organization that I mentioned our principles earlier. We believe in border security in a smart execution. That doesn't necessarily need to mean a physical border. There's certainly natural borders in some places. There's also infrastructure that is set up down there and is fully functioning, as well as there's 16,000 border security agents. And in combination of all those things, they have created about a 91% situational awareness for across the entire border, which is very good. Border crossings are also at an all-time low and have been. In between, I believe, like the early 2000s to 2016, we saw the lowest rates that we've seen. But the other thing that I think people get a little distracted on is that there's certainly people who come in through the southern border, but when we're talking about the undocumented population here, it's about 40% that are visa overstays. So they're people who came in here legally and overstayed. And a lot of that has to do with the process when people lapse because you have application times and things fall behind on an administrative end that you don't have any control of if you're someone who's applying for it. But the bigger picture here is that, we can't just do border security without fixing these broken systems that we have on the inside that result in the amount of people we have undocumented here. And so we really need a comprehensive fix. So, secure the southern border, secure the borders generally, do it in a smart way, but you have to do that while also fixing the current visa system we have. And that not only means those permanent protections for Dreamers and TPS holders, but it also means that we're not doing cuts to legal immigration in the meantime. We're not ramping up interior enforcement, which we know destroys communities here, particularly for people who are not public safety threats, but are, just community members trying to live day to day. And it also means that we're not doing major changes and cuts that result in less people coming here for asylum as refugees. So those are the kind of principles that we're looking for in a national fix.
Those cuts are a big deal. Can we get into an in-depth talk on that?
Sure.
I would like to talk today.
Yeah. So, you've seen, we talked about like drop off rates for some applications. Um, you had mentioned earlier that you're seeing lower rates of people coming in. We're also looking at processing time. So we got some report earlier this week about the citizenship processing time taking much longer than it's taken before. So to actually become a U.S. citizen is now taking a lot more time. And so really on all kind of pathways, you've seen people drop off. We've certainly talked to businesses that, have decided maybe they were growing down here and then decided, I don't know how sustainable it is for me as an international entrepreneur to grow my business here, especially with the influx of what's happening with the immigration system, and is this a safe bet for me to grow my business? And so you have people go to Canada that's encouraging people to come to start their businesses. You have people, Israel is actually a really hot spot for incubators and entrepreneurship, and so people are going to other places, and that harms the American economy in that it makes us a less competitive place. Immigrants are natural innovators. They have natural entrepreneurial spirit, coming here and trying to follow the American dream in itself. And so that has serious fallout consequences when you become a place that is viewed as less friendly to immigrants. And, we work with the ski industry up here as well and tourism, and they will talk about, fallout for international guests coming. Like, Colorado is obviously an international tourism destination for skiing. We have, I would say, the best mountains. But, the loss that resorts face when their guest population drops off because they'd rather go to the Alps or somewhere else where they feel a little more welcome. And then on the other side of that, you have visa restrictions where people aren't coming in to work on the employer side or employee side of that equation. And so you have less people coming in all around, and that's not good for the Colorado economy.
Right, and the Canadian dream just doesn't have the same ring to it as the American dream, right?
I mean, we're biased for sure.
Absolutely. Nothing wrong with Canada. I love Canada. But Marissa, I want to ask you, personally speaking, did you face any, I guess, people being mean about your status? Was that something that you had to deal with in your community? I know that you mentioned that Glenwood Springs was awesome and was helping you with scholarships and things like that to get so that you could get back to the society. But was there a stigma placed on you?
Yeah, growing up, when my parents were still undocumented, it was very important for us not to share our status. And so always, like, I went to a school where, like, the majority of kids, like, I had known since I came to this country when I was in 4th grade, and we'd grown up together, and none of them knew that part of me. So, like, when I couldn't have a driver's permit and I couldn't have a driver's license, I had to make up a story around that. And so I grew up in so many ways feeling like I wasn't able to be myself and to really fully own who I was and where I was coming from. And I think that created in me a big sense of shame around my status. And I really internalized, the messages that the media and kids at my school would often say around, like, being illegal, like, and just, like, really feeling like I had done something wrong, like my parents had done something wrong. And it took a lot of, like, learning how important my story was and how much I was also a part of this country, and this was also my America, and I belonged here as much as anybody else. And that was really important for me. And I think when somebody told me, like, you have an important story to tell, and, like, the challenges that you've overcome, kind of like what Kaytia was saying, right, have now given you a different spirit about how to tackle challenges, and, like, how can you now take what you've learned about overcoming those challenges to look at the challenges in your broader community and say, I can be part of the solution to those problems, and being really ready to do that. And I was really lucky that when I did come out as being undocumented back in 2014, the most important people in my life, right, those community members back in Glenwood Springs who said, like, we still love and support you despite that, have made a lot of difference. And I think also being around as an educator when I came out as being undocumented and share that story with my students, also having my students see, like, people who look like you have a pathway to opportunity in this country, and like the American dream is still achievable and the American dream is still alive, and being able to be a message of that for my students was really important, and something that really made me proud of where I was coming from, and made me really proud of my community. And like I have a deep connection to the Western Slope, specifically to the Roaring Fork Valley, because of those folks who have helped me get to where I am today.
It's awesome. And I love that you can speak to your class and your students about that. Did you face any backlash in 2014? Obviously, you had a nice community support you, which is amazing, and I'm so glad that you had that. But I imagine maybe one or two people kind of dropped out of your life, right? Or maybe not. I don't know.
You know, what I saw when I initially came out as undocumented, I felt a lot of support, and there was a lot of people who publicly stood out in support of me. I think that when I started to see the conversation shift was after the 2016 election. And, you know, my parents having a fear of like, now, you know, there are people who in a comment section, one in the Denver Post, I believe, said, I will like end the problem with people like you. And, you know, it's, you know, someone said something about like shooting me, and my parents became incredibly concerned about what it meant for me to be public about my story. And then for me, right, understanding that like, while I can at any time step back from sharing that story, it's a disservice to other people, to the 17,000 other Colorado Dreamers who are here for me to do that, but also for my larger community if I step back. And so I've definitely seen a change in tone from folks in the community around what it means. And I think a lot of it also comes from like not understanding what DACA is, like not understanding how much people actually contribute to our community. And so the more that we can say, I hear where you're coming from, let me talk to you about some real facts and about the ways in which immigrants are contributing to your community. Like I see a community like the one in the Roaring Fork Valley, and I know that the businesses that thrive and the industries that thrive in that place cannot survive without immigrants. And so we have to also be able to have that conversation. And I think what's so important right now is for us to be able to have dialogue with people who hold a different opinion, because I think a lot of that just comes from misinformation.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I would love it if we could all sit down and listen politely to each other, right? Not just think about the next thing we're going to say or have this argument ready in my pocket. I think having that conversation is an integral part of changing the system. And slowly, I think we're making some heads turn. But you're always going to have that one turd, quite frankly, out there that's going to wish a death threat on somebody they don't even know. They haven't given the time of day to. So we have a few minutes left here in this. What can we do? How can we get involved as an individual or perhaps a business owner? Maybe my neighbor is somebody that I know is undocumented, and how can I help that person? How can I get involved?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of ways. You know, you mentioned my title, which I know is a little hard to swallow, which is the ISWI, but that's the I Stand With Immigrants Initiative. And this is spurred from a really successful Immigrant Heritage Month campaign that we have done now for 5 years. And as part of this campaign, we bring in business partners from around the country and ask them to elevate the positive immigrant impact across the country. And so they will, you know, do blog posts, they'll host events, come up with playlists, and all kinds of things to help uplift that narrative. And because of the success of the campaign, we're now doing it'll be year long. And so the I Stand With Immigrants is a campaign that goes throughout the year with different kind of activation moments where companies can engage, and it's really in a solidarity fashion. There are, of course, political activations that we have, which are, of course, harder to predict in terms of timeline when things come up. But, you know, businesses can, if you're an employer or just a individual, calling your members of Congress, telling them that this is something that you want. When we talk about driver's license, calling your state legislators, writing letters, writing emails, all of those things still work. They still read them. They still listen to voicemails. And so those are ways that you can make an impact in kind of the more private sphere. But, you know, we do a lot of press work where we will do like education for people about what's going on, writing letters to the editors, writing opinion pieces and submitting them to outlets, I think is really effective. One of the things that Marissa said is talking to people who, may not necessarily agree with you. And I think that that's the most important thing you can do. I mean, speaking a message in an echo chamber is only as useful as the echo chamber is. And so going out and hearing where people are coming from in terms of how did they come to the conclusions that they're at? And what does it look like to actually meet a dreamer? And how does that, dissipate fears and rumors and change that public narrative? So there's a lot of public and private things that people can do. But for looking at ways to get involved and activated for Colorado, and for Forward, for your listeners who are out of the state, info at fwd.us is a great way to kind of get your foot in the door, and we'll always kind of keep a digital presence around like activation moments. So following us on Twitter, again at fwd.us, or US, no dot in Twitter. And so there are some channels that people can follow us and figure out what we're doing on a national and state basis.
Awesome. I love hearing that. As we know, this can be a really sensitive subject for some people, and you mentioned having that conversation with people that don't necessarily agree with you is a great way to get started. That being said, there are probably some sensitivities around talking with a dreamer. What do I need to be conscious of? How can I say I'm an ally, right? How do I get that message out there?
I mean, I think one thing that's been really important, like I had a moment where I shared my story and shared some of the advocacy work that I was doing with our members of Congress, and I had someone from Glenwood call me and say, "Can I ask you a few questions?" And I agreed to it, didn't know what I was agreeing to, and she just asked, "Can you share with me why you haven't been able to adjust your status?" And I thought like what I really appreciated about the conversation was like, one, this was a person who was willing with curiosity to approach the conversation and say like, I have some beliefs, right? And I also know I don't have all of the facts. And so I think like approaching any conversation that you have with people from a place of curiosity, and if you are ready to be an ally and are ready to be supportive, I think asking that person like, how can I best support you given where you're at? Like I know one of the things that was like for me really important after DACA was rescinded, I had people who offered to help support me during the renewal process. So whether that said like, I have $50 to contribute to your renewal fee, or I'm going to make you dinner tonight and I'm going to remind you that like you have a community of people that love, care, and support you, was something that was really meaningful for me. And I think I'll never forget those people because of that. So I think just being able to share that, I think right now there's a lot of fear within the immigrant community about sharing that. And so the more that you can actively say like, I'm a safe place, I'm a safe person, there will always be safety for you here, is really important. And I think one of the things I'm forever grateful for my employers has been that they have been supportive of my status, and when I've needed to ask for time off to be able to do my renewal process, that's been something they've been willing to do and work with me on. So I think if you're an employer, making sure that people, right, you might not know if somebody is a DACA recipient, and just sharing some of that like outward support for the community is really important right now as a symbol of solidarity.
Awesome. As far as having a community to go to, I assume there's some maybe forums out there that I could join if I am a dreamer or a DACA recipient, or perhaps I'm trying to get my status changed, right? And I'm on the wait list. And I don't feel okay with talking in my business about my status. Are there forums out there that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there different communities throughout Colorado have like dreamer groups, and so like getting connected to those. I know Forward has a really great resource called informedimmigrant.com, and so I, as an educator, use that tool to be able to find service providers for any of the immigrant families that I was working with. It provides people with updates on legislation and where things are at and how people can be supportive. So those are the ways that I think I would approach that.
Awesome.
And in terms of being a supportive employer, I would just add, Marissa mentioned like getting extra time off to be able to do some of the work for her applications. If companies are in a position where they can offer kind of financial encouragement for the applications, in addition to giving time off if they have, legal counsel that they can provide access to. And this varies on the size and the kind of budget of the company. But, all of those things internally are important. If the company wants to take a stance publicly on being supportive of the issue, they can release statements, they can call their members of Congress and let them know. There is a number of things that folks can do in allyship, and I think it's important to do those things, but also keeping in mind the directly impacted folks who may be working for you or you may be impacted by. People are in different levels of comfort around their status, and so checking in with those folks and also making sure that you are carrying their voice with you as you are going into these advocacy spaces, because it's very important that the people who are directly impacted really lead in their voice on these issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much, ladies, for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. Visit fwd.us and all the tools that Kaytia mentioned here today. And also be sure to call your congressman in your area so that we can get some immigration policy reformed. It's been a great pleasure talking with you both today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.